The Supreme Court chamber was filled with a heavy silence, the kind that comes just before a storm. Journalists leaned forward, pens ready, cameras fixed. Lawyers shuffled their papers nervously, waiting for the next move. Then, suddenly, Justice Amy Coney Barrett leaned forward, her sharp eyes locked on Representative Jasmine Crockett. Normally, a Supreme Court justice only addressed the attorneys arguing before the bench. But Barrett broke tradition, and her voice carried across the chamber, strong and cutting. "Congresswoman Crockett," Barrett began, her tone sharper than steel. "You say this case is about protecting democracy? Yet your own words show a disregard for the Constitution you swore to defend. How do you explain such a contradiction to this court and to the American people watching?" The room gasped. Reporters froze mid-sentence. Even the marble walls seemed to echo the shock. Never before had a justice directly confronted a sitting member of Congress during such proceedings. It was beyond unusual. It was historic. For a moment, all eyes turned to Jasmine Crockett. Would she shrink under the weight of the challenge? Would she retreat? Instead, Crockett stood. Slowly, calmly, she rose from her seat in the front row, lifted her blazer, lifted her chin, and began walking toward the microphone. Her steps echoed across the chamber. She carried a folder under her arm, filled with documents that, unknown to everyone in the room, would soon flip this case upside down. The tension was unbearable. Security guards instinctively moved closer, but Chief Justice Roberts quietly raised his hand. "Let her speak," he ordered. The chamber was frozen in silence as Crockett reached the podium. She looked directly at Barrett, unshaken. "You, Mr. Chief Justice," she said respectfully. "And thank you, Justice Barrett, for the opportunity to respond." The nation was watching. Millions would soon replay this moment again and again. If you're already shocked by how this is unfolding, make sure to subscribe right now, because what happens next will leave you speechless. To understand the weight of this confrontation, you have to know who Amy Coney Barrett is. At just 53 years old, she had become the most powerful conservative voice on the court. A former Notre Dame law professor, mother of 7, and deeply respected within conservative circles. She was nominated by President Donald Trump in 2020. Her appointment secured a 6-3 conservative majority, a shift that would shape American law for decades. Barrett was sharp, disciplined, and unafraid to clash with anyone who challenged her interpretation of the Constitution. To her supporters, she was a guardian of tradition. To her critics, she was a symbol of hardline conservatism. And on this day in this chamber, she intended to make that reputation clear. The hearing was about a new voting rights law authored and championed by Representative Jasmine Crockett. The law aimed to expand access to the ballot box and strengthen federal oversight over state elections. For progressives, it was necessary protection. Too many states, they argued, had passed laws designed to restrict voting access for minorities, students, and the poor. Federal standards were the only way to guarantee fairness. For conservatives, however, it was overreach. The Constitution, they argued, gave states the authority to manage elections. Washington had no right to interfere so deeply. The stakes were massive. If the court struck the law down, state legislatures, many dominated by Republicans, would continue shaping their own voting systems with little federal control. If the law survived, it would establish national standards that could transform American elections. It's just months before the next presidential contest. And at the center of this storm stood a freshman congresswoman from Texas. Crockett wasn't just another politician. She had been a public defender, a state legislator, and now one of the boldest new members of Congress. At 43 years old, she was known for her sharp mind and even sharper tongue. Supporters called her fearless. Critics called her reckless. But no one denied she came prepared. Always, in interviews leading up to the hearing, Crockett had been blunt. "This bill is simple," she told CNN. "It makes sure every eligible American can vote without unnecessary obstacles. If anyone has a problem with that, they should explain why they fear voters." Those words had set off a political firestorm. And now, standing face to face with Justice Barrett, Crockett was about to defend them in the highest court of the land. Normally, Lawmakers didn't speak inside the chamber.
House.
Their job was to write laws, not defend them directly before the court. That duty fell to the Solicitor General. But Barrett had changed the rules. By calling out Crockett directly, she had turned a routine hearing into a showdown. A clash of two women, one a Supreme Court justice, the other a rising star in Congress. Congresswoman, Barrett continued, you said the Supreme Court should stay in its lane. Do you deny this statement? Do you deny showing disregard for judicial authority? The chamber buzzed. Reporters' pens scratched furiously. Crockett took a breath and leaned into the microphone. With respect, Justice Barrett, she said firmly, my words have been twisted. I never questioned judicial review. What I said was that courts should not interfere with the certification of elections. That is a very different matter. She lifted her folder, pulling out a printed transcript of the CNN interview. Here are my exact words. Anyone can read them. A clerk passed the papers to the bench. Even Chief Justice Roberts raised his eyebrows. Barrett scanned the document quickly, her lips pressed in a thin line. Unshaken, Crockett continued. As for the Constitution itself, Article 1, Section 4 is clear. It says Congress may at any time by law make or alter regulations for federal elections. That is exactly what my bill does. Nothing more, nothing less. Gasps filled the room. Crockett had not only defended herself, but she had also thrown the Constitution back at the court. Barrett's eyes narrowed. Solicitor General had just finished his defense of the new law when the chamber shifted in an unexpected direction. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. Attorneys were meant to argue, the justices to question. But Barrett had cut through the tradition and targeted Crockett directly. Reporters whispered among themselves. This has never happened before, one muttered. Another shook his head, already imagining tomorrow's headlines. Crockett, however, was steady. She leaned slightly against the podium, eyes sweeping across the justices. Our Constitution, she said, is not vague on this matter. Congress has both the duty and the authority to protect the right to vote. History proves that when states abuse their powers, federal action is required. Barrett folded her hands. Congresswoman, she replied, her tone cool but firm, your law doesn't simply regulate, it rewrites the rules of identification, mail-in ballots, and early voting. That is not regulation. That is control. The air thickened. Every word felt like a blade striking steel. Crockett didn't blink. Not control, justice, Barrett protection. Let's not forget that in Arizona v. Enter Tribal Council 2013, this very court ruled that federal law supersedes state law in voter registration. And decades before that, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 established federal standards to stop discriminatory practices. Those standards saved American democracy. My bill follows the same path. Barrett's eyes narrowed. Those were extraordinary circumstances. Extraordinary measures cannot become ordinary tools. Crockett raised her voice, still calm but firm. Then let's talk about extraordinary. Because what's happening in many states right now is exactly that, extraordinary efforts to restrict votes, closing polling places in minority neighborhoods, cutting Sunday voting because churches use it to mobilize, passing ID laws that college students cannot meet. These are not coincidences. They are targeted strategies. Gasps filled the chamber again. She wasn't speaking in theory. She was accusing lawmakers directly and publicly. Then came the moment no one had expected. Crockett opened her folder and pulled out several documents. These, she said, holding them high, are internal memos from state legislatures. They were leaked to me by concerned staffers, and they are crystal clear. She handed copies to the clerks, who passed them to the justices. Barrett took one, scanning it quickly. Her face didn't change, but a flicker of recognition passed in her eyes. One memo, Crockett explained, says ending Sunday voting would reduce turnout from black churches. Another openly admits that strict voter ID rules were designed to cut college student turnout. These aren't speculations. These are their own words. Reporters' pens scratched furiously. Cameras clicked nonstop. Within minutes, news outlets across the country would be running breaking alerts. Crockett reveals secret memos in court. Barrett spoke slowly, as if weighing her words. Congresswoman, even if these documents are genuine, they don't alter the structure of the Constitution. States still retain the right to set election rules. Crockett stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. And that is why Congress was given enforcement power. The 15th Amendment, the 19th, the 26th each, one says Congress, shall have the power to enforce voting rights. It is not an option. It is a responsibility. The justices shifted in their seats. The audience leaned forward. For the first time, Barrett didn't have an immediate response. Chief Justice Roberts cleared his throat. Congresswoman, you are making a bold claim that Congress's authority here is not only valid but necessary. Do you suggest that states cannot be trusted at all? Crockett met his gaze respectfully. Not at all, Mr. Chief Justice. States manage elections fairly. But when some use their authority to silence voters, Congress has no choice but to step in. Federal oversight exists for exactly those moments. Barrett leaned forward again. But how do we draw the line? At what point does federal oversight become federal dominance? Crockett answered. Without hesitation, the line is clear. States retain their role, but Congress must act when rights are being violated. If a state denies women the right to vote, Congress acts. If a state denies young people the right to vote, Congress acts. And if states now create barriers to weaken minority voices, Congress must act again. The silence afterward was heavy. Crockett's words rang across the marble chamber like a bell. Outside the court, crowds gathered around giant screens broadcasting the hearing. Protesters and supporters alike stood shoulder to shoulder, listening to every word. One college student whispered to his friend, "She just destroyed Barrett's argument." A woman holding a sign that read, "Protect our votes," shouted, "That's right, Crockett, tell them the truth." Social media exploded like Crockett versus Barrett and voting rights showdown began trending worldwide. Commentators on live television called it the most electrifying courtroom moment in years. And inside, the duel continued. Barrett, who had started the exchange with full confidence, now looked pressed. Her voice softened slightly. "Congresswoman, I do not dismiss your concerns. But the court cannot become a tool of political convenience. Federal power must always be restrained." Crockett leaned closer to the microphone. "Justice Barrett, protecting fundamental rights is not political convenience. It is the core of democracy. You worry about restraint. I worry about survival of equal access to the vote. If we lose that, everything else collapses." The chamber was silent again. Barrett glanced down at the leaked memo in her hands, then back up at Crockett. For once, she said nothing. Analysts later said this was the moment the tide shifted. Barrett had opened the confrontation, confident she would expose Crockett's contradictions. Instead, Crockett had met her, blow for blow, armed with history, law, and hard evidence. Even conservative justices exchanged uncertain glances. Roberts rubbed his chin, clearly unsettled. Justice Kagan leaned forward, visibly impressed, and Crockett, standing tall at the podium, knew she had not only defended her law, but had also changed the narrative. If this face-off has you hooked, make sure to subscribe now, because the most dramatic twist is still ahead. The chamber had grown heavy with silence. The arguments had taken a turn no one had anticipated. Justice Barrett, the court's strongest conservative voice, had entered this exchange expecting to corner a freshman congresswoman. Instead, she now found herself on defense, where sharp lines met with sharper rebuttals. Crockett's confidence unsettled. Even the justices who usually avoided politics. She wasn't just answering questions, she was flipping them back. Armed with the Constitution and undeniable evidence, Chief Justice Roberts finally broke the silence. "Congresswoman Crockett, let us assume for a moment that your interpretation is correct, that Congress has authority to regulate federal elections more broadly than states. The question remains, where's the limit? Should Congress dictate every polling place, every ballot design? Every hour polls must remain open?" Crockett turned her gaze toward him, her tone respectful, but unwavering. "Limits exist, Mr. Chief Justice. Congress should not dictate ballot design or micromanage local details. But when states intentionally create barriers that suppress citizens' rights, Congress must intervene. That is not micromanagement, it is constitutional responsibility. Leaned forward again, her voice low but pointed. But who decides what is suppression, Congresswoman? Who draws that line? Every state has different needs, different traditions. One could call any regulation suppression. Crockett's reply came instantly. The line is drawn by evidence, by history, and by this court's own precedents. When a policy's purpose and effect are to silence certain groups, that is suppression. And when such suppression is proven, Congress is bound to act. The justices sat still. Every word struck. Deeper, Crockett raised a hand, almost like a teacher explaining a lesson. We've been here before. In the 1960s, states claimed they were protecting election integrity, but their literacy tests and poll taxes were nothing but tools to keep black citizens from voting. It took the Voting Rights Act to break those chains. Today, history repeats itself. Only the tactics have changed. Barrett shifted in her chair. Congresswoman, those were extreme cases. The world is not the same now. Crockett's tone sharpened. And yet the goal is the same. Fewer voices at the ballot box. Do we really want to wait another generation before admitting what's happening? The words echoed, forcing even Barrett into silence. The audience could hardly breathe. Some clutched their notepads as if holding on to history itself. Even the clerks, trained to remain neutral, seemed wide-eyed. One reporter whispered to another, "She's not just defending a law, she's rewriting the narrative of the entire case." Outside, television anchors spoke over live footage of the hearing. "This is extraordinary," one said. A sitting member of Congress standing toe-to-toe with a Supreme Court justice and holding her ground. Social media exploded further. Hashtags like Barrett cornered and Crockett defends democracy trended worldwide. Clips of Crockett's fiery defense spread in seconds, shared by millions. Barrett finally spoke, though slower than before. "Congresswoman, Crockett, let us test your argument. Suppose a state passes a law requiring voters to show ID. Is that suppression?" Crockett nodded slightly. On its face, perhaps not. But look deeper. If the law is written so narrowly that thousands of young people or working-class citizens cannot meet its requirements, while wealthier or older citizens can, then yes, that is suppression. Intent matters. Impact matters. Barrett frowned. Intent is hard to prove. Crockett lifted the memos again. Sometimes it isn't hard at all. Gasps filled the chamber once more. Justice Kagan leaned forward, clearly intrigued. "Congresswoman, your argument suggests Congress can step in whenever states create barriers with discriminatory intent. Do you believe this court has been too passive in such cases?" Crockett paused. She knew this was delicate territory, but she also knew millions were watching. "With respect, Justice Kagan," she said carefully, "I believe this court has at times retreated from its role. The decision in Shelby County v. Holder weakened the Voting Rights Act, removing preclearance that once stopped discriminatory laws before they spread. Since then, states have rushed to pass restrictions. If Congress cannot act now, when can it?" Her words cut deep. Legal scholars in the audience nodded. Analysts watching on television scribbled frantic notes. Barrett's lips pressed into a thin line. This wasn't the direction she had wanted. Crockett's voice softened. "This isn't just about documents and clauses. It's about people. A grandmother who stands in line for 5 hours because her precinct was closed. A college student told her campus ID isn't valid. A worker who can't vote because polls shut down before his shift ends. These are Americans. Their voices matter. As much as anyone else's." She paused, letting the silence hang. "This law is not about politics. It is about people." Even the harshest skeptics in the chamber felt the weight of her words. Justice Barrett looked down at her notes, then back at Crockett. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. For the first time in years, she seemed at a loss. The chamber buzzed quietly. Was the justice retreating? Barrett finally said, almost softly, "Congresswoman, the Constitution is not always clear. We must be careful not to twist it for convenience. Crockett answered firmly, "and we must be careful not to abandon it when it demands action. The Constitution gives Congress the power to enforce rights. Today, I am here to remind this court that rights mean nothing without enforcement." The line landed like thunder. Legal experts watching later agreed this was the moment. The momentum shifted fully. Barrett had begun the clash with authority, but Crockett had countered every move, turning defense into offense. Even Roberts looked unsettled. Justice Sotomayor leaned back, smiling faintly. Justice Thomas avoided eye contact altogether, and in the gallery, every observer knew they had witnessed history in the making. If this battle between Crockett and Barrett has kept you glued to the screen, don't forget to subscribe now, because the final act of this showdown will shock the entire nation. The courtroom felt less like a place of law and more like an arena. The battle between Coney Barrett and Jasmine Crockett had grown into something larger than either of them. It was no longer just about one law. It was about power, history, and the meaning of democracy itself. Barrett, determined not to lose ground, straightened her robe and leaned forward once more. Her voice carried the weight of final authority. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, steady but colder than before, "your passion is undeniable, but passion does not write law, nor does it interpret the Constitution. That is this court's duty. Your arguments risk transforming this court into nothing more than a servant of Congress. That cannot happen." The audience stirred. It was the justice's strongest strike yet, framing Crockett as someone who wanted to reduce the court to a powerless body. Crockett, however, did not flinch. She met Barrett's gaze and answered with the same unshakable clarity she had shown all morning. "With respect, Justice Barrett, you are mistaken. My argument is not about turning this court into Congress's servant. It is about reminding this court of its role, to uphold the Constitution, not weaken it. The Constitution explicitly gives Congress the power to regulate federal elections and enforce voting rights. If this court strips that power away, it is not protecting the Constitution. It is rewriting it." The chamber erupted in murmurs. Even Roberts raised his eyebrows, as though surprised by the boldness of her charge. Then Crockett delivered her finishing move. She reached once more into her folder and pulled out a final set of papers. "These," she announced, her voice echoing, "are sworn statements from voters across the country, college students, elderly citizens, working parents. Each one of them was denied the right to vote because of the very restrictions my bill seeks to address. Real Americans, it's real lives, silenced." She handed copies to the clerks, who distributed them to the justices. The silence was deafening as Barrett glanced through one statement. It was from an elderly woman in Georgia who had been turned away because her ID had expired. Even though she had voted in every election since 1964, Crockett's voice grew softer, but stronger. "If we pretend these stories do not matter, then we have abandoned the people we serve. This is not theory. This is not politics. This is reality. And reality demands justice." Barrett's lips tightened. She was the strongest conservative voice on the bench, but even she could not easily dismiss the evidence or the emotion behind it. For a long moment, she said nothing. She stared at the statements, then back at Crockett. The cameras caught it all: the pause, the silence, the look in her eyes that betrayed uncertainty. This was not a victory for Crockett, not yet. But it was something no one expected. Barrett hesitating. Chief Justice Roberts leaned forward, breaking the stillness. "Congresswoman, your defense of this law has been unlike anything I have seen before in this chamber. But the court must decide not based on emotion nor politics, but on the Constitution alone. That is our charge." Crockett nodded respectfully. "And that is all I ask, Mr. Chief Justice. Read the Constitution as it is written. Article 1, Section 4, the 15th Amendment, the 19th, the 26th. They all say the same thing. Congress has the power to enforce and protect the right to vote. I am not asking this court to go beyond the Constitution. I am asking you to honor it." Her words carried no anger, only conviction. The audience sat in stunned silence. Reporters scribbled madly. Television anchors outside the building interrupted their commentary. Just to let the live feed roll, one whispered into her mic, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are watching history." A Supreme Court justice pressed, cornered, and challenged like never before by a Congresswoman who refuses to back down. Social media feeds roared louder than ever. Clips of Crockett's calm but relentless defense went viral within minutes. People across the country, across the world were watching. At that moment, the clash had become symbolic. Barrett represented the long tradition of judicial restraint, cautious and careful, unwilling to hand too much power to Washington. Crockett represented the new wave of lawmakers, fiery, determined, willing to challenge the very system to protect what they believed was right. It wasn't just a battle of arguments. It was a battle of eras. Barrett finally spoke again, her voice quieter than before. "Congresswoman Crockett, you argue that Congress must act whenever states cross the line. But tell me this, do you truly believe that federal power can solve every injustice? Is that the answer to every problem is more Washington?" Crockett inhaled slowly, then answered with calm strength. "No, Justice Barrett. The answer to every problem is not Washington, but the answer to every violation of rights must be justice. And if states deny that justice, then yes, Washington must act, because without it, the Constitution is just paper." The words struck like lightning. The chamber gasped one final time. Barrett sat back, eyes unreadable. The duel had ended. As the session closed, Roberts adjourned the court. Crockett returned to her seat. But the eyes of every person in the chamber followed her. The cameras stayed fixed. The fight was not over. The court would take weeks, perhaps months, to decide the case. But the confrontation had already entered history. Scholars would write about it. Journalists would replay it. Citizens would remember it. And for Barrett, the justice who had begun the clash, the day would be remembered not for her questions, but for the answers she received. If this extraordinary showdown shook you, make sure to subscribe right now, because the story of what happened after this day is even more unbelievable.